This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Okay, so Hume's legacy kind of reminds you of the Olympics legacy, doesn't it? So you kind of this desolate East London wasteland scrub, which I believe is to become a UCL campus when they're all gone. So surely it's better, as with the Olympics, to look rather at its beginning. Say Danny Boyle celebrating all things British, or in this case, to look back at Hume's actual work rather than to see what we make of it. And my task here is to look a bit at Hume's aesthetics. Now, as I'm sure many of you know, Hume, in the introduction to the treatise, lists 4 sciences of man: logic, criticism, morals, and politics. And the original intention when he published the first volume of the treatise, which contained books 1 and 2, was that there would be a book for each of the 3 sciences that hadn't been covered in the first volume. But as you all know, he only got as far as writing the 3rd book of the treatise of morals, and then kind of the whole project of the treatise disappeared, and he moved to the essay form. So when people talk about Hume's aesthetics, what they normally focus on is an essay that Hume wrote kind of 18 years after he published volume 1 of the treatise. So in 1757 he publishes the 4 dissertations. Now, the original intention of that collection was rather fraught, and it was to contain the retelling of his views of geometry that you get in part 2 of book 1 of the treatise. But he was prevailed on not to embarrass himself in public by publishing that, and so that got scratched, and then he had to find other work to include within the 4 dissertations. And he wrote the 2 essays that he published at all on literary criticism at that point in order to complete the 4 dissertations, so of tragedy and of the standard of taste. So when people look at Hume's aesthetics, what they tend to focus on is of the standard of taste, and that's what we'll do here. But as we'll see, my concern in the end is going to be not so much on questions aesthetic, although that will be part of the concern, as actually on aspects of Hume's moral psychology, okay, because we're going to make sense of some aspects of what's going on in Of the Standard of Taste in that way. Yes, it's going to work. Okay, so 2 questions that I want to focus on today to do with Of the Standard of Taste. First, what is the standard of taste for? Okay, the essay is set up. It tells us in the introductory paragraphs that what we need is a standard of taste, but why do we need a standard of taste? And it's not quite as obvious as it might seem. And what I'm going to suggest is it's very important to see Of the Standard of Taste as a kind of sentimentalist tract, sentimentalist account, which, as much as anything, wants to emphasize the stability of sentiments in contrast to the variability of mere opinion. Okay, so in a way, it's a paean to the wonders of sentiments, despite their seeming variability. And so the standard of taste is part of the explanation of that stability. So in order to understand how the standard of taste functions within the essay, I'm going to suggest we need to think of it as functioning in order to provide that stability. Okay, and so related to that, and I'll go into this second question in rather more detail in a few minutes, those of you who know Of the Standard of Taste know that Hume, when he's elaborating the concern of why we need a standard of taste, introduces a number of analogies. So he compares judgments of taste with colour perception, and in the parable of Sancho Panza's kinsman, he compares refinement of taste with fine gustatory discrimination. So again, sense perception. So on one dimension, you might think that when Hume is looking for a standard of taste, what he has in mind is something like a perceptual model, and various people have tried to develop such an account from the essay. At the same time, it's clear, and we'll see the relevant passages, that Hume seems to think that we have a standard of taste only if there are actually existing true judges who exemplify the 5 virtues of those who can really discern things which are beautiful from things which are merely mediocre. He thinks those actually have to exist. So there's a question, why does he need the true judges to exist if the main picture of what the standard of taste involves is the proper operation of our powers of discrimination of beauty? Okay, so there seems to be a tension there. And what I'm eventually going to suggest, and this is where we'll end up, is that if we see what's going on, is that the standard of taste is part of the explanation of the stability of sentiment, then the stability of true sentiment relies on the contagious enthusiasm of true judges. Okay, so you need the true judges to exist for their feelings towards the most beautiful, on the whole, for Hume, literary works, is what he tends to focus on, for their enthusiasm for those things to be communicated throughout society. Okay, so again, it's when we see this as a distinctively sentimental account, we can also see why the judges have to exist in the role that they're in fact playing. So that's where I want to argue to. And it will take 5 sections, which I'll have to go very quickly. Okay, so first, I want to remind you, just give you a brief outline of the essay, and slightly more detailed one on the handout for you. So just to lay the land of what Hume's discussion of matters of taste are. I'll then give you a couple more reasons to think that we should think of the essay as distinctively concerned with sentimentalism about taste, and to some extent morals, and contrast that with, there's a very famous and very engaging article by David Wiggins called A Sensible Subjectivism, ? And Wiggins uses of the standard of taste to try and sketch what he sees as an improved Humean subjectivism about morals. Okay, so he wants to read into of the standard of taste a kind of subjectivism about aesthetic and moral distinctions. But for reasons I'll try and spell out under 2, I think that we need to think of it more narrowly as sentimentalist rather than subjectivist, and I'll talk briefly about that contrast. In that context, I want to suggest we get some puzzles about what's going on in the essay. So there are some notorious tensions within the essay, slightly different from ones most commonly discussed. I think the most common discussions of the essay focus on whether the standard of taste involves some kind of vicious circularity. I'm not concerned with that at all. I mean, I think it's clear that it doesn't. But nonetheless, the puzzles that are raised, I think, are familiar, but I think they're acute once you see that Hume's account needs to be seen as a sentimental one, that you can't step back to a weaker subjectivist view. And I'll both make the problems more acute, but suggest a route to solving them by stepping back from worries about textual consistency, which the initial worries that I raised will be, towards more external criticisms of Hume's theory. So Kantians love using of the standard of taste as a target empiricist theory of aesthetics to say, this just can't be done. It can't properly deal with the evaluative or the normative aspects of aesthetic judgment. That beautiful things call for, demand, or require our appreciation of them. Humean, they suggest, really can't deal with that. One very nice expression of that is Malcolm Budd's Chapter 1 of Values of Art. And that parallels actually, David Wiggins also suggests that somehow the normative or evaluative aspects of our aesthetic or moral response. It's somehow bleached out of Hume's account. And Wiggins thinks that's a mistake, and if we put it back in, you get a better subjectivism. And what I want to suggest is, at that point, is that actually, if you could find those normative or evaluative elements within Hume's account, then one would solve the problems that I've raised under 2, which we'll go into detail in a few more minutes. And then, fourth, I'll suggest how, if we look back at Hume's theory of the passions, in fact, you do find the resources to provide just that framework within the aesthetic account. And so finally, under 5, we'll get to spell out what the role of the true judges are and how they provide for the stability of sentiment. And that's the game plan. Very quickly, standard of text. I think it's 34 paragraphs, elegantly structured essay. It's most natural to see it as falling into 3 parts. 8 paragraphs set up the problem. 18 paragraphs offer the solution. And 8 paragraphs go through some consequences of the account that's so been set up. Okay, so Hume starts that Hume's problem, at least as he gives it to you in the first couple of paragraphs, is that there are variations in judgment of taste. Indeed, that there are variations in all judgments. I mean, he starts to saying there are variations in judgment of taste and in matters of opinion. But he also, at that point, puts there's a contrast with the case of science. Because in variation in judgments of taste, which are more extreme than they may on surface appear, those turn on specific judgments rather than general principles, whereas those are things that people can agree on in science. So opinions vary in science mainly on general principles, it turns out. And so he suggests we need to search for a standard of taste. Not quite clear why that should follow, but that's what he says. And in contrast to the need to search for the standard of taste, which he puts forward in the 6th paragraph, he then sets up a skeptical philosophy which seems to suggest that a standard of taste would just be impossible. Okay, but he says that gives a paradoxical conclusion, because it would be absurd to think that Ogleby was as fine as Milton, and I guess some of you have read your Milton, but I suspect none of you have read your Ogleby, so you can think that here Hume was probably spot on in his example, and he compares that to supposing that the mountains of Tenerife are no higher than a molehill, and that would be absurd, and so likewise not to recognise differences of quality of beauty, that would be absurd to suppose that can't be. So we can't take the skeptical philosophy seriously, and so that does suggest that we really must be able to... That's not me, that's something else. Pay attention in the back! So we know Hume thinks that in the face of variation of judgment, we need to look for a standard of taste, and that we should resist the enticement of skeptical philosophy to suppose that there could be none and such. So how does it go? Well, first he suggests that the principles of beauty are not knowable a priori. They somehow lie in the nature of man. But nonetheless, they do derive from general features or principles of human nature. And so variation in judgment indicates a defect in circumstance or operation of the mind. And this explains, Hume suggests, why, in fact, true judges who are just going to land on exactly what is the case are going to be rare. And they need to exemplify 5 virtues, which off the top of my head, if I can remember, are a strong sense, a fine discrimination, practiced, developed through practice, practiced in comparison, and devoid of prejudice. Okay, so those are the 5 virtues. You need 2 internal, 3 of training, which would allow you to be a true judge. Okay, so at the end of the discussion, solution, So the question is, where are true judges to be found? You might think this is very worrying if they're very rare and they need to develop these properties. Well, Hume's very quick with that. He says, there's no bother with that. It's just a matter of fact to determine what they are. And although they're rare, they're influential. And we'll come back to paragraph 26, which I think of as closing off the solution to the initially stated problem in a minute. So that will give us the solution. Okay, then the end of the essay, and I'll come back to this. This has a life of its own in current philosophical discussion. I'll come back to that puzzle in a moment. Okay, looks at some of the consequences of the count. So Hume admits that even given the standards set by true judges, there's still variation among people's judgments of taste, which reflect age, character, and the customs of people of a given age. And this leads him to suggest that to appreciate the art of other times, we must set aside prejudice. It turns out that we can't set aside our moral prejudices, but religion turns out to be of the same status as opinion in general. So, for instance, scientific or philosophical opinion, except it turns out when we get as far as the bigotry of the Roman Catholic Church. And that's the punchline which closes the essay off. And I think this, as I say in a moment, that's an important contrast. So that's broadly just the structural outline of the essay, and we'll come in a moment, I hope, to some of the details of what it's trying to do. Okay, so when people start asking, well, what's the standard of taste for, or indeed even what is the essay of the standard of taste for, then, particularly since Peter Kivy's influential paper in '67, there's a lot of debate over whether the standard is supposed to be playing an evidential role, simply as a guide so that you could know what the beautiful works of art are, or somehow it plays some constitutive role. And connected with both of those worries is a worry over whether there's some alleged circularity in the account. That if you need true judges to determine what the beautiful things are, otherwise it would be impossible to know or impossible for there to be beautiful things, isn't there now the same question about who the true judges are, and supposedly it will just keep going up. And likewise in this context, I think particularly those who think that the true judges are playing a constitutive role, many assume that the key problem the essay is really is distilled in the discussion of the sceptical philosophy. So those paragraphs 7 and 8, which I see as the end of the introductory discussion, people think that really is somehow expressing Hume's own view. And Paul Guyer, for example, likes saying, well, this is Hume's antinomy of taste. So the worry that there's this paradoxical conclusion. And so I think that leads people to think that what's going on in the essays, there's some, I'll come back to what I mean by subjectivism in a moment, there's a kind of subjectivist genealogy of the cognition of beauty arising out of mere feeling. So Hume starts with this picture that maybe our judgments of taste are a matter of feeling, certain feelings of pleasure. This is what he said way back in the treatise, that judgments of beauty are passions, they're secondary feelings. So we start with the idea that they're feelings, and then what the essay is doing for us, by appealing to the role that the true judges play, is showing how nonetheless these can play a certain kind of cognitive role, or quasi-cognitive role, leading us to represent, correctly or incorrectly, the beauty of objects. Now, I think that's not the happiest way of thinking of the essay. Now, there's a certain kind of quirk that you get in the historical interpretation of the essay, it seems to me, in that if you've never actually read the Hume, I guess there are many students of which that may be true. After all, I believe the Institute of Philosophy has hosted seminars on how to teach important historical texts when students have not even read them in translation. So presumably, when one faces such students, and maybe all they know of Hume's views in this area are actually from reading the secondary literature. if they read the secondary literature, then they might suspect that actually Hume didn't write 2 essays on criticism, but 3. Because there's the essay about the true judges, there's the essay about tragedy, and then there's the essay about what these days gets called imaginative resistance. Because, particularly given Ken Walton's paper in the late 90s about those last few paragraphs of the standard of text, there's a large industry of philosophy that discusses, well, is Hume right to think that you can't withhold your moral opinions in engaging in the pretense involved in understanding fictions of another age? And is it only morals, or are there other opinions? And then what explains this resistance? And so it's as if this is a completely self-contained discussion. And if Hume's essay was really just the genealogy of aesthetic cognition, it's unclear why the discussion of imaginative resistance should be in the same essay. So it seems to me that from this kind of quirk of philosophical discussion of the essay, the structure of the essay becomes very problematic. And indeed, I have seen some philosophical commentators deal with this embarrassment by suggesting this finely honed essay is in fact a spatchcock, a running together of ideas written at great haste, kind of like the patchwork theory of the transcendental deduction, they're kind of patchwork theories. And indeed, this is in fact, although she doesn't put it in quite this way, this is one aspect of Mary Mothersill's interpretation of what's going on there. She thinks there are hidden doctrines within the essay that you cannot take the structure of the essay at all seriously in itself. Now, this is undoubtedly true of some, particularly no doubt contemporary philosophical works of writing, written in haste or whatever, but kind of one thinks as an interpretive aim, it's kind of always the last point to say this isn't really a continuous narrative. It's working. So I think that's a puzzle about the essay. So we should have a reading of the essay in which it can be continuous. So that raises the question for us, why should the essay contain both issues? And I think there's another internal textual interest, which is, if we look at paragraph 2, which you have on your handout under Arabic 2, so this is the paragraph, it says, but when critics come to particulars, this seeming unanimity vanishes and it's found that they have affixed a very different meaning to their expression. In all matters of opinion and science, the case is opposite. So in paragraph 2, when he's first set things up, when he's creating the contrast, Hume gives the reader the appearance that there's somehow a superiority of opinion concerning science and matters of fact over judgments of taste with respect to constants. Gives the appearance of that. Once he sketched his account by paragraph 26, which I was marking as the end of the solution, we get an inversion of this, because he says, and though prejudices may prevail for a time, they never unite in celebrating any rival to the true genius, but yield at last to the force of nature and just sentiment. So this is an explanation, again, why Test of Time is giving us the great works of Ogilvy, oh no, that's not right, of Milton. And he contrasts this, he says, thus, though a civilized nation may easily be mistaken in the choice of their admired philosopher, they don't recognize the greatness of Beattie. They never have been found long to err in their affection for a favourite epic or tragic author. Okay, so here we have an inversion in the story. At the beginning it looks like matters of fact, opinion, are much more secure than sentiments, which judgments of taste and moral distinctions are supposed to be. But suddenly by paragraph 26, we've got suddenly our judgments of taste are much more stable across the generations than any opinions. Okay, so the essay involves this inversion. It's an important rhetorical trope that's going on in the essay, so we should try and understand it in terms of the narrative of the essay. And again, it seems to me that if we just think of the essay as trying to explain how feelings become cognition, then it's not going to do that. Okay, so what that moreover brings out, I think, is that Hume does not doubt the constancy of judgments of text. Okay, so it's wrong to emphasize too much what he says in the first paragraph, that there's variation in judgments of taste. Or what he says in paragraph 7 and 8 when he's expressing skeptical philosophy. How could we think that there's a right or wrong of this? Because he's assuming quite clearly that there just are absolutely stable judgments to be made about the superiority of some works of art over others. And so that's why I suggest that how we should think of this is that the concern of the essay is to explain that constancy, which is just taken as given. And the account of the standard of taste is going to be central to that. So put that way, we might say this way. Hume's essay focuses on sentimentalism, focusing on the idea that judgments of taste are feelings. Now, already in the treatise, Hume's emphasized the stability of feeling and habit in contrast to opinion and reason. He does repeatedly, from the introduction through, and when we get to book 3 in volume 2, he repeats the trope again in the very first section of that part. So this essay is repeating that thought at great length. So the inversion in paragraph 26 from what's said in paragraph 2 echoes that superiority of stability of feeling and habit. Okay, and the conclusion, the punchline against Catholicism, which, I mean, Hume is generally rude about Christianity, but particularly rude about Catholicism. It's anti-popery you can find, for example, in the section on promising, which Stuart mentioned this morning. And so likewise, you can see the setup of the end of the essay is an elaborate way of getting to a joke against the Catholics in the penultimate paragraph. And this reflects Hume's disdain for religion that's found in the first inquiry. So, Hume thinks that taking sentiments to be our response to beauty explains the concord in judgment of taste over the generations that he takes to be a manifest fact. Okay, so the kind of why the whole essay fits together, the idea is saying, look, think of judgments of taste as feelings. Well, of course, we think if they're feelings, then they'll just all be incredibly variable in contrast to opinion. Now, when we think the matter aright, we'll see that actually our judgments of taste are far more stable than any philosophical opinion or any opinion about a general scientific matter. And the stability takes the following form, particularly most strongly in relation to morals, which is precisely why they distinctively, as far as Hume's concerned, involve imaginative resistance, and then just have a quick dig at religion to distinguish religion from morals, put it on the side of speculative opinion. Okay, now in this context, I think, well, what do we mean by subjectivism here? I think minimally what we want to think of subjectivism, I think isn't words, like that. A subjectivist is someone who seeks to place explanatory weight for a phenomenon in the responses evoked in us. Okay, I want to put it neutrally as that, because I think putting it that way leaves open different stances to be taken about what there is or is not to be responded to. So you can have subjectivists who call themselves realists, David Wiggins does, or call themselves irrealists, Simon does, or call themselves nihilists, or people rarely call themselves nihilists, some people call them nihilists, deny the existence of various features. Or have what I think of as Hume's stance here. I think that the point of the skeptical elements in the fourth part of book 1 of the treatise is to tell us not to do metaphysics. Okay, and then you can get on, instead, carry on doing the science of man, which is what the rest of the book does. There's a whole tradition of writing about Hume's skepticism. A lot of it comes from my department in California, which kind of sees the skeptical discussions, particularly in the last section, section 7 of part 4, as kind of indicating the end of philosophy, as if the treatise came to an end at book 1. Ignoring, book 1 is published in volume 1, and you immediately go on to book 2. So the end of book 1 cannot be the end of whatever Hume was doing. So my colleague Garrett Broughton has this thing that there's a kind of irony in the introduction, because it's so enthusiastic about the project and now it's undermined by the end of book 1, but that can't work because you have book 2, which is carrying out exactly the project that is planned. So anyway, so if Hume is really sceptical about metaphysics, then his subjectivism shouldn't be defined, I think, in metaphysical terms. So I think, just think of subjectivism as an explanatory project. Okay, then sentimentalism is going to be narrower than subjectivism, because it has a view about what the response is by which the phenomenon is to be explained is. And in particular, it identifies the relevant response with a sentimental feeling in us. And here what's going to be distinctive and keep it sentimentalism is that Hume never gives up supposing that our judgments of taste are sentiments, they're feelings. All of our moral judgments, all of our judgments of taste are just going to be feelings. Okay, now you could be a subjectivist without affirming that. You could think that the explanatory weight rests in responses on our part, and the initial responses needn't be thought of as genuinely cognitive. So they're just feelings, or they're just sensations. But after suitable modification, whatever story you like to give, different ones in the case of colours and taste and so on, then you end up with something that's cognitive. Okay, so such a view needn't claim that all of our moral judgments are feelings, even if they're somehow grounded in feeling. And a lot of modern subjectivism works in that kind of way. It starts with a phenomenon that isn't in itself cognitive, and then it tries to give you a story about how something cognitive develops out of it. Okay, if Hume's essay is an essay in sentimentalism, as I've been suggesting, then Hume does not give himself that leeway. Okay? He's saying all the way through, our judgments of taste are feelings. Given that, I think that there are two central problems in the text, in the context of sentimentalism, as well as a return to one of our initial questions. Okay, because if we're thinking of judgments of taste as all and only feelings, then how does that really fit with the analogies with sense perception? Okay, those who often want to paint Hume as somehow rescuing cognitivism within subjectivism love the comparison with colour perception and the Sancho Panza story to show how, even if it's feeling, somehow it can end up being a representation of the world. Okay, but as we'll see, there's a very obvious problem if you want to hold on to the idea that the judgment of taste is feeling in that story. Now, secondly, and kind of related, as we're going to see relatedly, how does the picture of taste as feeling comport with the role of true judges as providing the standard of taste? Okay, and this is a familiar worry that Mary Mothersill and Jerry Levinson pushed, and I'll come back. And so in turn, what that's going to end up is, again, reminding us of our main question about the text: why does Hume need true judges actually to exist in the first place? So a little bit more about each of these questions. Contrast the case of taste with a dispositional theory of colour. Whatever you think of dispositional theory of colour. I don't think anyone's given a workable such account, but that doesn't really matter. Because there seems to be a problem in relation to taste, which you wouldn't have for all the other problems with the dispositional theory. So some people say we start with the idea of, say, a sensation of blue, which is just a sensation in itself, neither correct nor incorrect, but it can come to count as illusion because the normal perceiver in normal circumstances does not have such a sensation when confronting the object. Okay, so in suitable context, something which in itself needn't be thought of as representational or cognitive can come to be cognitive. That's a familiar story. Now, what's in this case? Well, look, our interest in the sensation can turn out to be just as its function to present the colour of the object. Okay, so its status as illusion can then be of interest to us, even if the sensation in itself has a characteristic which it would have whether or not it was representational. However, an aspect of sentimentalism about taste is the thought that there's a distinctive feeling of pleasure which we have when we confront something beautiful. And that beauty in the object is just the power to elicit such pleasure. That's what Hume says in the treatise. So, I think, if we think of a judgment of something as beautiful as a pleasurable feeling in this way, then it's no puzzle why we should have an interest in beautiful things. We have an interest in things which will cause us to feel this pleasure, and we have an interest in pleasure. But it's much less clear why we should be interested in having true sentiments. Why shouldn't false sentiment or bad taste be as equally interesting to us, because they're still pleasures, aren't they? So, in this case, because the interest in the sentiment is independent, seemingly, of any representational functional role it should have, just ascribing to it the functional role as a dispositional theory of colour would do, now comes into tension with the original thought about it within sentimentalism, that our interest in beauty is our interest in pleasure. Second question, how does sentimentalism comport with the role of true judges? I think the worry that we've just had in relation to the analogy with sense perception just gets worse when we introduce the true judges. Okay, because in the true judges story, if we take seriously that there have to be true judges and what they feel determines what's beautiful, then at best my own symptom is my own sentiment, my own pleasure in an object is best a symptom of the presence of beauty. Indeed, and so Mary Motherstill called it the true judge hotline. You know, if you're interested to find out what's beautiful, which should I read? Which should I put on the shelf? Not read. Milton or Ogilvy. Then you just call up the true judge hotline and they'll tell you. So there's no prediction on this model that you have any interest in yourself having any true aesthetic sentiments. Okay, you might still have an interest in having aesthetic sentiments, but you know, those can all be listening to the Saturdays, as far as you're concerned, rather than reading the fine works of Milton, because as long as it's giving you the right kind of pleasure, then that will be your interest in. So that suggests that if we take seriously, as the sentimentalist does, that our interest in beauty is part to be explained by the pleasure we take in it, how can the account which appeals to the true judges as being the criterion succeed in explaining that interest? And that's what Jerry Levinson, for example, is very fixated on and suggests, you know, we should just delight in our bad taste. You know, that's what we're really interested in taste. Now, I think, parce Jerry, Hume does not face this puzzle. So, Levinson's objection is an objection to certain reconstructions of Hume, but not Hume sentimentalism as it's given in this. That's the second question. And I think, in the end, that this all connects back to trying to understand what exactly is the role of true judges in setting the standard of taste. Why do we have to suppose that there are judges who are doing this? Okay, so in paragraph 22, we're told that their joint verdict is the true standard of taste and beauty. But earlier than that, in the discussion of Sancho Panza's kinsman, in the 16th paragraph, where we have, from that story, we have the leather thong, which has an iron ring on it, and the kinsman can detect that one can detect the leather and the other can detect the rust. Okay, this suggests that we have a picture of sort of perfect discrimination of the way in which things are put together. And that gives a story which Hume is playing with in that paragraph, and appealing to the idea that there are universal principles of taste which maybe a canon of good criticism would direct us towards. So we need to understand something about the composition of human nature in order to understand taste. It doesn't look like we actually need any true judges around. So why would we need the perfect actualization of the principles, which is what the true judges are, in order to have a standard of taste? Why wouldn't it be enough just to try and work out how human nature works and write down good works of criticism, canons of criticism? That would get us there as well. Okay, it doesn't seem to be an epistemological matter. It doesn't seem to be that judges are more knowable than what would be good criticism. Both would seem to have epistemological puzzles, though. Okay, so initially, as things are set up in the middle of the solution, there just seems to be a tension. Okay, if we can resolve that tension, I think we can also answer the other two questions. Okay, and now, to try and get a handle on answering those questions, we'll push a further line of criticism. Okay, this is what I'd already mentioned, the kind of Kantian. Is there really an evaluative or normative dimension? Is there properly an evaluative or normative dimension in Hume's account of taste? A lot of critics have thought that there haven't. For example, at the beginning of Values of Art, rather than quotes from your handout, Malcolm Budd complains that Hume's appeal to the true judges does not provide a genuine standard. Because even if they all coincide, it does not explain why they ought to coincide in taste. And he thinks that idea that you ought to feel pleasure in the face of something beautiful is what really needs explaining. And I think that in some ways that parallels a complaint that David Wiggins made in Passing the Sensible Subjectivism, where he suggests that when we kind of construe Hume as supposing that something beautiful is that which evokes pleasure in us, then perhaps it should rather be that that pleasure is the appropriate or merited response to an object, where appropriate or merited seems to introduce an evaluative element, which isn't there in the original Hume, which seemed merely to be causal. Now, I'm going to come back and ask whether it's really true that there's no evaluative element. But first, I want to suggest that if such a normative value element could be found in our responses, then this would be a way of solving our first two questions, our first two puzzles. Because we could explain why wrong sentiments, bad taste, was something we had an interest in avoiding. Because, and hence explain why the verdicts of true judges might matter to common people. If my pleasure in objects is conditioned by whether I ought to be pleased at them or not, then the verdicts of true judges may move me for my pleasure in something where their verdicts differ from mine. So I'm really enjoying listening to the Saturdays. Peter comes along and warns me that listening to trash, fabricated, girly pop music is beneath all grown men's dignity, and suddenly all pleasure in my listening drains from me. So if, psychologically, if in fact that was going to happen, then I'd have an interest in avoiding having pleasure in those things which were hazard to Peter's verdict in that way, versus those things which I could robustly enjoy. Okay, so if an interest in pleasure is a key element of the aesthetic, then if the verdicts of true judges are somehow affecting me, then that interest story will remain. I think that Budd and Wiggins are just supposing there is no such element in Hume, so this thought would be of no help to Hume. But what I very briefly want to suggest is perhaps they're not right to suppose that. Okay, so Stuart mentioned earlier that Book 2 of the treatise really doesn't turn up in the second inquiry. It's kind of disappeared, and I think that's entirely right, but it doesn't disappear entirely because the Dissertation of the Passions is one of the 4 dissertations published with of the Standard of Taste, but it's a much butchered and shrunken account of the theory of the passions. Oddly, what it is it's a presentation of kind of the same verdicts about the passions as Book 2, without giving any of the mechanisms which Hume uses to justify those verdicts. Okay, but it gives some evidence for thinking, something I guess that's slightly controversial, that maybe Hume hasn't entirely changed his mind in this area. So I want to use that as license to go back to Book 2 of the treatise and use elements of Book 2 of the treatise to explain how Hume can allow for the relevant normative or evaluative elements that would condition the responses here. So now very quickly, some elements of Hume on pride and fame in Book 2. Okay, so, as I said, the sentiment of beauty is a passion for Hume. It's a secondary impression, an impression of reflection, in contrast to the deliverance of the senses and bodily pains and pleasures. And secondary impressions arise from other perceptions, impressions and ideas, and in many cases of such impressions, there are principles which govern their arising. This is the whole point of the first two parts of Book 2, which, so Hume divides the passions into the direct and the indirect, and he immediately sets off two parts of Book 2 to discuss the indirect passions, which kind of inverts the way in which he talks in Book 1. He doesn't start with the simpler elements and go to the more complicated one. He starts with seemingly the more complicated ones and leaves it as long as possible to say anything about the direct passions that he can, pretty much at the end of Part 3. Okay, and so in the case of pride, pride and humility are the two central cases of the indirect passions, the self-directed ones are love and hate, the other directed ones, which the first two parts of Book 2 take up. The mechanism of sympathy has a central role in the account, and sympathy is first introduced in section 11 of Part 1, Hume's discussion of fame. Okay, so this is a very important point at which we understand how things are working. And I think the example of pride as an indirect passion will make us see how evaluative elements can enter Hume's system. Now, for Hume, pride is a form of self-love. It's caused by objects which give pleasure and which are both related to oneself and are distinctive or singular in some way. So this is the key principle which defines pride. Okay, so Hume thinks that all kinds of different things may be the cause of pride. So his example is a fine escritoire. You can think white iPhone 4S for an equivalent. Okay, he thinks all kinds of new objects and very different objects can all be the elicitors of pride. So we shouldn't think that there's some common feature in the world which the objects which elicit pride have to have in common. Rather, we should think that there's some principle in the mind which explains why they all go together. And this little phrase is really the relevant principle for pride. Okay, and so he gives this little causal story which Anthony Kenny, in the book that Stuart mentions, hates so much, in a way I think misinterprets what's going on, that what happens is that an object is the cause of pride, and so what happens is initially some object gives you pleasure, and at a later point you remember the object, and so you have an idea of the object, and that idea of the object itself gives rise to new pleasure. Okay, in this case it's a passion, it's a secondary pleasure, it's a joy. But if the object in question was somehow specially related to yourself, then that leads, by association of ideas, that leads the mind, turns the mind to the self. And the pleasure spreads from the object to the self. And the case where the pleasure spreads from the object to the self is that of pride. Okay, so pride is this case where an object which is so associated with yourself that the mind gets to have pleasure at oneself and not just the object, is when you have this distinctive thing, being proud. And so that's Hume's general account, and then he goes through in various ways the conditions under which objects can be peculiar to yourself and so a possible cause of pride. Now, why this is worth mentioning at the moment is because some interpretations of Hume's theory of pride build in an evaluative element from the start. So, for instance, Donald Davidson glosses Hume's theory as a cognitive theory of pride. He says it involves the judgment that some object proper to oneself, such as a fine house, makes one praiseworthy. So notice praiseworthy seems to be an evaluative notion. Now, were Davidson's gloss a good gloss on Hume, then the discussion of fame would be utterly puzzling. Because Hume wants to know, why do we seek the praise of some men and not others? That's what he starts that section with the question on. And it looks like if pride is just thinking that something makes one praiseworthy, then the answer to this is trivial. And it's an answer that Hume gives in passing, but doesn't think it's a fundamental answer. And that's, you're interested in the praise of those whose opinion you trust, who would be reliable guides to whether you're praiseworthy. That's what you're interested in. Okay, but Hume doesn't think that's the fundamental thing. Instead, Hume introduces the mechanism of sympathy into the discussion at this point, because what he wants to emphasize is that the praise that you're most interested in is from those that you take to be similar to yourself. Okay, and sympathy is the mechanism where the pleasure that others feel at you gets converted into pleasure in your own case. And this plays a distinctive role in why praise is something that we're interested in. But the details of that account for another day. So, the moment, just to take a measure of this, look, is there directly an evaluative element in Hume's theory of pride? Davidson says yes. Textually, that's got to be wrong. Okay, but even if there isn't directly an evaluative element, maybe there's an evaluative element that's going to be mirrored. To suggest that, we need to see how one of the ways that sympathy can affect us is the sentiments of one person can be affected by the sentiments of another. Obviously, that happens when someone praises you and you get that warm glow. But one of the things that we might also be interested in is the mechanisms which explain the idea of unwarranted or inappropriate pride. And that Hume discusses as well. So when he's discussing the moral significance of pride in Book 3, he discusses why we hate the vain glorious. I won't go through the quotation, you've got it on your handout. But basically, people who are inordinately proud of their mediocre talents cause the rest of us great pain because we can't but imaginatively engage with the pleasure they feel, and that makes us feel inferior to them, but that then conflicts with our own sense of being superior to them. So this dissonance makes us despise them. Okay, now, what this brings out is that there's a certain instability in some of the pride we feel, even if there isn't directly the evaluative element in it, because one kind of pride obviously is inappropriate where it rests on false association with self, so plagiarists, our favourite kind of student. But what we're most interested in here is pride where the pleasure that we take, that is the basis of pride, leads to displeasure in others. So, you think, these are such fine shoes, and everyone thinks they're utterly absurd. Okay, you're proud of your shoes, and everyone else thinks, God, he looks like a clown in this. Then there's a dissonance between their attitudes and your attitudes. Now, Hume's observation in 322 is that groundless pleasure at yourself make others feel less pleasure at themselves without the compensation of great love at one. Okay, so, struck with awe at the mighty in front of us, we're humbled, and that's not a nice thing to feel, but it's compensated by the pleasure we feel by being in the sight of greatness. So things kind of balance out. But when it's Mr. Mediocre who's feeling so wonderful about it, there's no such benefit of pleasure back. So that's where contempt comes. So the displeasure of others, their contempt, is easily communicated to us, however they try and hide it. And so our sympathy with them recognises their displeasure and makes us feel displeasure in the light of our own pleasure. So our pleasure fights with the displeasure. So Hume's thought is that pleasure and displeasure don't happily sit together, they start cancelling each other out. So this would be to say that unwarranted pride is not robust. You're incredibly proud of your shoes. You spend the morning wandering around the flat. What nice shoes, what nice shoes. Your head swells to an unimaginable size. You go out in the street and you hear the silent sniggering as you go down the street, and suddenly your head shrinks. Okay, so the pleasure that you take in the shoes is not robust. Okay, and that's, so even though there isn't directly the evaluative element in Hume's account, as witnessed by the section on fame, the role that sympathy plays within the story, in effect, acts as a vehicle of an evaluative element. The social robustness of a sentiment is, in effect, the vehicle of its appropriateness. That's the story. And so we might suggest that is what can be going on in the story of judgments of taste. So, note, by the way, that Hume's not concerned with people finding ugly things beautiful. Okay? He doesn't conceive that people could find the Saturdays beautiful. Okay? So, in contrast to what their music, I'm not talking about that physical quality. So he doesn't conceive that there could be real variation in what is of aesthetic merit at all, which a lot of current discussion suppose he's concerned. He's much more complacent and conservative than that. Okay, so what he's really concerned with is that people may fail to recognize the greater beauty of some things over others. And indeed, this is kind of essential to the kind of subjectivism he has, because he's trying to project ranking of beauty onto preference, which is a kind of crazy matching. One shouldn't think that one could reconstruct a ranking of the more beautiful over the less simply from the preferences even of true judges. A point that's often made. Anyway, so someone's failure in taste is going to be a failure to have a large enough pleasure in response to the most beautiful object. So a passage of Milton in the face of some tedious essay of Ogilvy's. Now, really here the thought is that sentiments of others can play the role of enhancing or diminishing the pleasure one has, and so reversing one's comparative verdict. Finding something mediocre really beautiful will convey to others sentiments which they will not echo, and will lead them to feel contempt for you, as Peter now does, thinking that I take secret pleasure in the sentiments. Whereas conversing, failing to find something really beautiful which really is, I've got too many reallys, something beautiful which really is, may be overcome by the presence of stronger sentiments in others. And that, in effect, is what the true judges do for us. So the pleasure true judges feel in response to objects is communicated through sympathy with them to other men. We're not entirely similar to such judges. They are rare and possess virtues which we lack, but their virtue and rarity give them social advantage, and we imaginatively identify with those we take to be our social superiors. So the existence of true judges and the contagious nature of their enthusiasm underwrites the constant appreciation of true beauty. Because Hume takes it as just fact that there is the appreciation of true beauty. He thinks there are ancient texts which we all recognise as great works. So there must be true judges among us, however rare they be. So true judges must actually exist in society and not just be ideal or hypothetical, because it's through the conveyance of their sentiments concerning the beautiful that good taste is passed down through society and over generations. And basically that's the end of the message. Okay, so I think we've now explained why Hume is committed in the story to saying true judges must actually exist. If they didn't actually exist, there'd be no communication of sentiments. To explain the constancy of feeling. Okay, but given the way in which our sentiments can be affected by the sentiments of others, then we have a mirror of the kind of normative complaints against him. Okay? We have an interest in having pleasures which are robust. Okay? I won't have so much pleasure in something if the moment I tell Simon I like this book, he gives me a withering, scorning look back. Okay? So I have an interest in having robust pleasure, and so an interest in taking pleasure at what's truly beautiful. Okay, so in that way we see why having an interest in the sentiment of beauty is also having an interest in the true sentiments of beauty, which was the main puzzle I introduced, and just showing why the true judges are playing a distinctive role in securing the true sentiments. So, that's it, the message about the sentimentalist tract. Leave it there. Thank you.
I really love that, Michael. I'm sure absolutely on the right track. Just one supplementary remark. You failed to mention the very early essay of the delicacy of taste and passion. And that does suggest that what I would see as a supplementary point to yours, if I remember rightly the conclusion of that essay, Hume seems in that essay to be suggesting that if you immerse yourself in literature to the point where you begin to approximate to a true judge, you do the comparison, you read around, you practice discrimination, all the right things, your pleasure increases and your immunity to the pains of the world increases because you gain this kind of armchair stoicism where you just, things are terrible in Syria, but I'm reading Hamlet, and so I'm not quite so touched and upset as I would otherwise be. So there is a kind of almost prudential element in approximating to the true judge. And I just wanted to comment on that.
That's a very nice point. Yeah, no, I agree with that. I guess what's interesting is, so one might think in some ways that indicates a foreshadow of Mill's higher and lower
Absolutely, absolutely. It's very right, Mill. I was thinking just that. And it seems right. I mean, I'm sure Peter gets more pleasure out of listening to rock guitarists than I do, because he knows what's good about the good ones, and I don't.
This is true.
Yeah, I suppose I'm just wondering why exactly on your account it's such a good thing that there are true judges. I mean, suppose that there just weren't any. Would that be a really bad thing? So you could now really, really enjoy the Saturdays with nobody kind of frowning at you, or at least nobody whose opinion you kind of respect and admire frowning at you. Usually listen to, Burmese, so I could listen to his mom or whatever. Everybody would be happy. It'd be great. It'd be like you could walk around with your nice shoes without feeling the disapprobation because you don't feel that sense of having to defer.
When you say, would that be a bad thing, what are you packing into that? Because are you saying, would that be a world in which the truly beautiful things would be other than they are? And I don't think that would follow. Or are you saying, isn't that a worse world than our actual world in some evaluative sense? I don't know which dimension of evaluation, and Hume can give no account of that evaluation. Because I think I'd agree with you that there's no evaluative perspective which says that we ought to live in a world in which we're surrounded by things truly of beauty. Although, as things are, given that there are true judges, we all have an interest in living in a world with beautiful things. But it's true that from the point of view of our own pleasures and so on, we would happily live in a world of the Saturdays with the Peters of silence.
So if we just took out all the true judges and didn't replace them, what on your story would Hume say about the situation that we would then be in?
Well, there'd no longer be stability of sentiment, of aesthetic sentiment. But nothing further follows from that.
Okay.
I mean, we're not in that, according to Hume. Hume's very from a kind of 20th century, since I think the obsession with the subjectivity or relativity of value seems distinctively 20th century. That supposed predicament of finding out that people from other countries don't like the same pop groups as us, that's supposed to create a crisis of faith, that is not a worry for Hume. Okay, Hume has no doubt about what the fine works of art are. And mainly he's focused on literary matters. He doesn't seem to have I mean, clearly relishing fine strokes. I suppose it could be stroke of the pen, but it seems more to evoke painting. So he has no interesting things to say about the visual arts, and pretty much nothing to say about music. So any things of aesthetic interest for him seem to be literary texts. But he's just convinced there obviously are great literary texts which still exist. So we face this question. Well, how have we got to be in a position to recognise this? Now, certain kinds of Kantians want to push a kind of transcendental question, which is supposed to be, you know, how do we have a guarantee that we can latch on to the beautiful? And I think Hume's not interested in that. Nor does he doesn't have to think that there's any moral impulse that we ought to live in a world with beautiful things. So if things go really badly and all the true judges die off, they get bird flu or something, and no further ones get generated, then, you know, taste goes to hell. That's from our current perspective, that's unfortunate, but there won't necessarily be any of our descendants who will be, from their perspective, worse off.
So the true judges are, the existence of the true judges is explaining stability, but it's not part of Hume's greed to, as it were, endorse the fact that we have.
Which depends what you mean by endorse. He thinks, without a doubt, there are beautiful objects, such as Homer's Odyssey, and he thinks there are people who are distinctively gifted at seeing what's beautiful about it, and he can think that's a wonderful thing. So all of those endorsements, it's got to be something transcendental that is missing, I think, and then you've got to have some reason to believe we need to adopt that transcendental perspective.
Hi, thanks very much. That was great, and it persuaded me to go back and reread the essay on taste, which I haven't read for some time. 2 or 3 questions occur. One, you did use the expression, I think, groundless pride. And I just wonder whether groundless is really the word you want to use, because that does seem to imply that, well, yeah, maybe
groundless pleasure.
Groundless pleasure, yeah. And that does seem to imply that there is some underpinning of what is well-founded pleasure, to use another metaphor, and what isn't. So that's, I mean, maybe you just change the word. The second thing is Hume's theory, and this is about his theory. I'd just be interested to know what your reaction is. It doesn't seem to allow for development in matters aesthetic, art and literature and music. I mean, be it Picasso or Miles Davis. I mean, in each case, very significant development in what is aesthetically the case. It would seem to me he's going to be stuck with the 18th century in Europe, and then no, I'll leave you with those two. I've got another one.
Okay, good. No, both very nice questions. I guess I'm not worried with groundless being there, but I agree that, you know, one could read that and say, well, doesn't that presuppose that there's an antecedent conception?
Yeah.
But I don't think it has to presuppose there's an antecedent one. It just requires that we can draw the distinction between groundless and grounded pleasure. And if given how the mechanism works, there is such a distinction to be drawn. It's just the explanation goes from the harmony of people's natures out to drawing distinctions in the world. It's not that the pleasures are tracking things in the world themselves. So I guess I want to hold on to it, but I take your point.
But on that one, the appropriateness of the object of pleasure, certainly that's for Hume important in pride, would seem to me to introduce a rather different set of considerations. How appropriate, and if the appropriateness is because basically the sound judges think it's right, and I'm getting additional pleasure from hearing what they say that confirms my reaction. That seems to move it from being an aesthetic judgment, as we might have said, to one of pleasure from social acceptability, which you can get in a whole variety of ways.
Well, no, you get both kinds of pleasure. So you're quite right that there's a distinctive. Hume thinks that the sentiment of beauty is a distinctive pleasure of approbation. But again, what we would have here, I mean, we can see actually, if we went through explaining the mechanisms of fade, we would see how it works. This is association of impressions here. So it's a pleasure which is a pleasure at a social aspect of being praised, would by association increase a distinct pleasure, which was the aesthetic pleasure. So we don't have to confuse the different pleasures in order to get the social mechanisms to work.
They mutually reinforce each other, which is why I never asked my mother what she thought of Dostoevsky. There wouldn't have been much reinforcing taking place at that point. Well, in that case, the last one is a fairly obvious one. What if you have the experts, the judges, like Leavis and his contemporaries, absolutely head-on at each other? So there's apparently two schools, as regularly as the case. Could Hume cope with that? Would he
okay, good. So in fact, so you've got two questions about what Hume can do. So let's take the other one first and go back to so the other one you said, well, what about innovation in art rather than in judgment? And I think, one, you're right to say that Hume, as the essay is written, takes no account of that. He doesn't have any sense of innovation. But I don't think the account is inconsistent with innovation. What it wouldn't have an explanation of is why judges would innovate with a cultural tradition. And so whether, indeed perhaps he doesn't really have a conception of how, and this connects with your second question, other question, whether there can really be variation in true judges at all. Because the picture does seem to assume that of true judges, whichever age they are and whichever age of man they're in, they're going to agree about the beautiful objects that they've encountered. And so that would seem to suggest that they could anticipate the innovations of Picasso, could see the point of it, even though the cultural setting which brought it about and the history which led to it was they were deprived of. So perhaps there is a problem about innovation of art because, but here it's distinctively because there's the assumption of the uniformity of true judges, and so that comes back that he just thinks the Leavis situation just isn't possible. Which, I mean, in that case it's less practically, probably. Leavis isn't a true judge, but
there you are. You see.
Yeah, but obviously Hume is. There is a way in which Hume is incredibly complacent about aesthetic dispute, in a way that those who want to use him now to try and find faultless disagreement, I think, are insensitive to him.
Yeah, thank you. If my pleasure, I'm sorry, if my aesthetic judgments are just feelings and my interest is just in pleasure, why couldn't I render my pleasure in my bad taste robust simply by coming to take pleasure in the fact that it doesn't accord with the judgments of others?
Well, no, that is a possible...
being a hipster.
that is a possible source of pleasure. I mean, again, go back to the pride case before, which you would connect with. So, some people take great pride in being eccentric in certain kinds of ways. So, that, of course, involves an additional level of interest that you have. You have to, I mean, here, Hume actually is quite psychologically realistic. You have to set in place certain additional mechanisms and thoughts to take pleasure at the disapproval of others, but you can do. And so that would be possible in the aesthetic case. You could take pleasure in having pleasure which didn't match the pleasure of others. But notice that in this case, although you could have such pleasure, it's not clear that that pleasure would by association increase the distinctively aesthetic pleasure that you are having in the bad object. So it doesn't show that your interest in having aesthetic pleasure would lead you to pursue bad taste.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was thinking if the only reason why I wouldn't want to pursue bad taste in the ordinary case is not because there's some normative component to my job. I mean, not because I'm trying to kind of work out what's actually deserving of my aesthetic appreciation, but only robustness. It seems like you can get robustness more cheaply by just ceasing to care. I mean, like just stopping.
Yeah, so I think there are two things going on there. So, look, one, I don't think you can get robustness more cheaply.
Okay.
At least on Hume's view of your psychology, it's just not up to you. I mean,
Right.
philosophers have this wonderful belief in self-invention, self-recreation. I'll just change my preferences. Hume's never a great believer in agency, so it's not really up to you what the pattern of pleasures you have. So I guess he doesn't believe that you change yourself. But secondly, I think it's slightly unfair or describes the situation when you say, look, how the subject themselves should be conceiving of it is that all they're interested in is the robustness of their pleasures. Now, how Hume is describing it is they're interested in the truly beautiful things. Mm-hmm. The question is, what are the psychological mechanisms which underpin your taking pleasure in beautiful things? And the vehicle of that is going to be the robustness of the pleasure that you have. That's picture now. Suppose you're fully self-knowing about it, what you're saying. Can you be happy with just thinking that all that's going on here is the robustness? I think that's beginning to take us back to the kind of transcendental question which Helen was alluding to. Yeah. And I think there, Hume's actually on very strong ground. Okay, because remember where Hume's starting from is from a complacent confidence in his knowledge of great works of art, which indeed, I mean, he's right about what were the great works of art he encountered. He's insensitive to disagreements about. So he knows that there are these beautiful things around. So why should he take seriously some po-faced, faux German attitude that says, yes, but are you really entitled to knowing that Milton and Homer are great? What a silly question. Mm-hmm. But obviously these are great works of art. So I think, there is a stance that Hume can take which just stymies that kind of transcendental.
Yeah, when he's talking about the sort of social influence of the true judges, it seems to me he has sort of two strategies. One is the sort of enthusiasm thing, and the other thing is the sort of conversion metaphor. Those two seem to, because the enthusiasm thing doesn't seem robust at all, because it would mean that works of art could propagate themselves by just eliciting great enthusiasm among their whereas and in any case enthusiasm works against because the conversion metaphor is about the acquisition of an autonomous enjoyment.
So what do you mean by conversion?
Where he says every convert to the admiration of a real poet or orator. You see
so you mean conversion as in religious conversion?
As in, yes. Yeah. So that's about the acquisition of an autonomous attitude on the part of the the new convert, rather than and there may be a nudge necessary, but it's not sort of entirely driven by the enthusiasm of.
Oh, I agree, it's not entirely. I mean, and again, I think this connects with the last question, because it's got to take you back to the object. But actually, I mean, I agree with you that if we make it look like it's just one dimension and it's the strength of the pleasure of the true judges, that's not going to...
No.
So it's clear that in this paragraph there's an additional empirical hypothesis that Hume makes, which he doesn't really explain, which is the true judges not only have these pleasures, but they're apt to communicate to others, so they'll have the trickle-down effect that the government so wants our undergraduates to have in relation to each other. And there isn't really an explanation given of that.
No.
There are hints of the idea that somehow true judges are such that we will admire them on encountering him. And hence they will then have social status which will encourage us to be sensitive to their judgments, but that's not really spelled out. And I suspect, again, part of what's going on here is the kind of complacence that he has, that he's just working back in Dawkinsian Jasot's story. Look, we have these ancient works of art around us that are so beautiful. We all know they're beautiful. How has this been? And so the true judges are just hypothesized. He doesn't offer us one true judge.
No.
They're incredibly difficult to find, and isn't this a problem? No, it's not a problem at all.
Yeah.
Why isn't it a problem? I take it it's not a problem just because they're a necessary theoretical posit, and so it turns out this other aspect which you must posit of them is that they will have the influence.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect also that he had a sense of, that there were these social mechanisms which are intricate, and because they're intricate, as it were, they're also robust in a way that he never really quite spells out.
So would this make sense? The idea, I mean, could he entertain this? The idea that the skills of the true judges are actually dispersed in the population. So if the true judges just sort of lack certain powers of perception, I mean, we all have the same underlying taste for the beautiful. It's just that they can point out distinctions in different types of rock music that I wouldn't have recognised until it was pointed out, and so on. If it's just those sorts of powers, they don't all have to be concentrated in the one person. I mean, there could be, someone might just have just a bit of perceptive power, and someone else a little bit of other perceptive power, and altogether this increases the appreciation of beauty.
Well, I guess that's a very nice question. In a way, what that pressing back to is, so couldn't we make it more like just the idealized picture, in which there's an ideal of having all the skills together, but actually we just need them each actualized in distributed people? I think in the end, given the picture that Hume has, that's not going to work, because what needs to be communicated is the relevant sentiment. Okay, but it's only if you've got the 5 virtues together that you're reliably going to feel at suitable intensity the sentiment in response to the relevant object. But if you don't have the sentiment, then you can't communicate it through sympathy to others. Okay, so if we distribute the skills, we don't have a mechanism to distribute pleasure, so it's not going to change. And in a nice way, that brings out why it's distinctively sentimentalism which will need the true judges, and something which is subjectivist but ends up being a bit cognitive won't need the true judges to do this. It can rather have the whole community, which in a way I guess is how David really thinks of it in the end. I mean, he wants the community to play the role of the true judges. Right. He doesn't need the true judges.
Which doesn't really work, because it flies clean contrary to the Sancho Panza story. They're exceptions, they're not the community.
Yes,
they're much better.
I had a really good, given that there's something that Hume could have difficulties explaining them, is that once you have a true judge, and sort of 18th century ideal of you having good taste across borders, so they will have an influence on other people regarding every domain of taste. Whereas, as you were describing, you would take Peter's sort of influence on music and maybe Simon's in opera. So it seems that we're selectively sensitive to the influence of true judges, domain by domain, in the domain of taste, and not. Maybe you wouldn't trust.
But I think that's consistent. But I think that's.
Or sorry, or offer.
I think you're right that there's nothing that Hume says which is sensitive to that idea, but there's nothing inconsistent in the story with the idea that different genres or domains of aesthetic object require different groups of true judges.
But you should be, once somebody is a true judge, you should be influenced by them all across?
No, for the relevant objects of which they are true judges. Okay, there'd be a question how you became sensitive to that competence, but that just connects back with the general epistemological issue of how you become sensitive to someone's competence in the first place. Okay. It's not clear that it creates an additional level of problem.
Okay. Sorry. If you have a follow-up.
Sorry?
Is it the follow-up or do you have
yes, it's leading on from that, so should I? Yeah. I wondered if you're a little fierce, Mike, about the epistemological problem there, because presumably it is at least largely empirical, whether somebody's listened to a lot of rock music, is interested in it, has got attention towards it, has the ability to distinguish. They can say, oh, that's, I'm trying to think of the name of a rock musician. Who's the one, Peter? That's Clapton. That's Eric Clapton.
That's Peter Motschloff,
yes,
for example.
He's
a rock musician.
That's
I
Eric Clapton.
wouldn't say he's a rock musician. He's
Peter Motschloff. Yeah. So those are empirical questions. Somebody can tell whether it's Clapton or not Peter.
No, I agree. No, it's a matter of fact. It
Yes.
can be settled.
I thought you were criticising him for saying this is a matter of fact that can be clearly...
No.
I'm sorry.
What I was suggesting that there was a seeming nonchalance in the fact that it's a matter of fact, but who's to say how we settle it? And I was suggesting that, and Hume doesn't list any true judges.
No.
And so I think you should see them as a theoretical posit as far as he's concerned.
Probably got Shaftesbury and Addison in mind.
Probably, but it's interesting that he doesn't mention, and he doesn't discuss any works. I mean, so he suggests in paragraph 16 that in effect we need works of criticism. This will lead us to aesthetic judgment. But by the end, that's really not the important thing. And again, I think if we see that the thrust of the essay is really to show the superiority of sentiments, then you don't really need that. And so in the context of paragraph 26, what's really going on is this. We just know that there are all these beautiful artworks around us. But we could only know this if there were true judges. So there are true judges. I'm not going to tell you who they are, they're incredibly different. But one of the things you said actually is a better response, I think, to Ophelia, which is when we look at the 5 virtues, since the relevant virtues are, two of the virtues are practice at engaging with the objects and comparison, then of course if we know which objects you've experienced and compared, and you haven't listened to any of the music, then you haven't developed the virtues in that domain to make you a true judge of that. So among the virtues are virtues which can end up being domain specific.
I think there's no true judges in any description of these, as distinct from the objects that they're criticising. The thing is that you know a true judge because he changes the description of the object in a way which gives you a great deal more insight and different descriptions of it and comparisons that you wouldn't have thought of, and so illuminates objects in a way that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. We take levers, for instance, he makes us see someone like Lawrence in comparison with Eliot. Only that comparison draws you in and makes you think, well, usually he's got something to say to me. He's a judge of these kind of objects, literature. But then again, and we've got to, I don't know if Hume takes into account the fact that these people can change their minds. I mean, Levis was hard on Dickens, but afterwards he thought that Dickens was one of the greatest writers. But not at first. He was very tough on Dickens and thought he wasn't worth reading. So, you know, there's a much more complicated I don't know if Hume ever tries to really grapple with the notion of true judges that can't be distinct from the descriptions that we give to the objects which they're supposed to be true judges of.
Yes, so I mean, a couple of points coming up from what you say. First, I think you're quite right that one of the ways in which our opinions get shifted is by being informed about how an artwork works and comparing it with other artworks. And Hume alludes to that, as I said, in paragraph 16, but it kind of drops out in the discussion of paragraph 26. But in full dress, clearly his theory would combine aspects of reason with aspects of sentiment, much as he suggests in the appendix of the second inquiry. So we would expect the same story to come here. But once you have reason involved in that way, so someone informing you about artworks, then presumably you could be informed about artworks by critics who are less than true judges. Remember, after all, the true judges are the ones who get everything exactly right. Okay, but you can learn from people who don't get things absolutely right.
What do you mean by exactly right is in question?
Well, for Hume it's not, actually.
Yes, well that's the interesting thing I was trying to do.
Well, it's a question, it's an interesting thing. How interesting it is depends whether we're mired in the crisis of the 20th century or not. But the... so, since the true judges for Hume get everything right, they're going to kind of be a bit more distanced from those people that we normally encounter when we're informed by their opinions about artworks. So again, that brings out again the way that the true judges really are this theoretical posit. So for him, in a way that you're sceptical of, many people are sceptical of, I don't know quite how sceptical of it we should be, he starts from just recognizing some works of art as really beautiful. They're really beautiful, we all know they're beautiful. That creates the problem which the true judges are the solution to within his broad sentimentalist picture. So there's no question but that we have this knowledge. Okay, if you start from a perspective in which you question whether there is such a thing as beauty or our knowledge of it, then his kind of account is not going to appear.
Thank you, Mike, for very interesting.